Most of the eukaryotic cells contain an organelle called as mitochondria. Now, the number of mitochondria depend upon the cells about which we are talking. So, some cells contain only one mitochondrion, while some having thousands. It depends upon the need of the energy, because it's a membrane-enclosed organelle that creates majority of the energy source in the form of adenosine triphosphate. For this reason, it's commonly known as nuclear power plant of the cell, or nuclear powerhouse of the cell. So, mitochondria is responsible for production of energy. It will synthesize ATP and energy to perform different actions inside the cell. That's why it's also called as nuclear power plant of the cell. So, there is a theory known as symbiotic theory. It says that the mitochondria came into existence after a symbiotic relationship between eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic system. Anyway, an eukaryotic cells engulfed a prokaryotic system. After some time, they came in interaction with symbiotic relationship. And the mitochondria, the prokaryotic cells, then became the part of eukaryotic cells. Now, mitochondria is not just responsible for the production of ATP, but it also takes part in some different action as well. For example, other notable functions of mitochondria include programmed cell death, apoptosis, that is a process in embryology that we will discuss in upcoming lecture much more in detail. But you can see that we make our fingers in our hands. It's just in the result of apoptosis, because when a nuclear power plant, it destroys, so it also destroys some other things as well. So it also kills the own cell of the own cell. While the other functions are calcium signaling and cellular differentiation. It's also a term used in embryology that we will discuss in the upcoming lectures much more in detail. But cellular differentiation is the differentiation of the cell from undifferentiated cells. Let's discuss the composition of mitochondria. So each mitochondrion consists of two phospholipid bilayers known as the inner membrane and the outer membrane. The space in between these two is known as the intermembrane space, and the innermost component is called as mitochondrial matrix, which is responsible for the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle that we will discuss much more in detail in just a moment. So we have the outer membrane and we have the intermembrane space, then the Cristae, that is called as inner membrane, and the innermost portion of the mitochondria is called as mitochondrial matrix. Actually, the Krebs cycle takes place in this region, while the proteins are responsible to attach more and more protein, because much more protein are important in mitochondria to produce energy, to produce more ATP. So, cristae are the enfoldings formed by the inner membrane. This greatly increases the surface area of the membrane to attach more and more protein to produce much more ATP. Now, let's begin with outer membrane. The outer membrane is greatly similar to the plasma membrane. It's a phospholipid bilayer and contains protein-lipid composition just similar to plasma membrane. It also contains some integral proteins called porins. They can allow certain molecules through via facilitated diffusion. For instance, the large integral proteins can allow pyruvate and NADH to pass through. Basically, the integral protein Porins can allow with the electrochemical down the electrochemical gradient. So it allows NADH and pyruvate to pass through to be used in we will discuss it in glycolysis. That these two are much more important in the mitochondrial matrix that will produce ATP from these molecules. Now, move on to the intermembrane space, also known as perimitochondrial space. This is the region between inner and outer membrane. Thus, the outer membrane is permeable to small ions and molecules. The concentration of these ions and molecules is the same in the intermembrane space in the cytosol. So, the concentration of the ions and molecules will be the same in the cytosol and the intermembrane space. Now, let's move on to the inner membrane. The inner membrane contains a much higher concentration of proteins than outer. It's impermeable to essentially all ions and molecules and contains a multitude of proteins that can shuttle molecules into and out of matrix. It also contains the electron transport change, etc., a series of proteins that establish a gradient. So the inner membrane is impermeable, so it cannot allow all the ions and molecules to go into the mitochondrial matrix. So the protein concentration in the inner membrane is much more higher than the outer membrane. For example, the integral protein Porins cannot found here, and some NADH molecules and pyruvate cannot cross to the inner membrane. So there are some proteins that act as an enzyme to actually facilitate to diffuse the ions and molecules to the matrix. So, mitochondrial matrix, this is a space which contains a majority of the proteins found in mitochondria. Many of the proteins act as enzyme in citric acid cycle, ATP synthesis, that is also known as Krebs cycle. And the mitochondrial circular DNA along with the mitochondrial RNA is found here in mitochondrial matrix.